Messini and I had the honor of sitting down with Indigenous actors Julie Lumsden and Amanda Trapp. This conversation and the sharing of these two women's experiences was so thought-provoking and important, and we hope this propels more conversations of its kind for years to come. Please listen, absorb, and reflect. Enjoy. So, if we can start with the two of you telling us about your Indigenous roots, and was your culture very apparent and upheld by your family growing up, or did you learn of your history through other avenues? And then as well, if you can tell us how you identify as an Indigenous person, like what you would prefer to be called or how you self-identify.
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, so I'm mixed, obviously. My mom is white and her roots are like German, Austrian. My dad is Cree Soto and his roots are in White Bear, which is in southern Saskatchewan in Treaty 4. So I won't go into the details of it just because my family history is very complicated, and just because it's public, I don't want to trigger any of my family members who might see this. But I'm gonna say that I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff over coffee or a walk or something if anybody who knows me is interested. But basically, I was estranged from my father from ages 6 to 24, so I had no contact with him and my family. So I didn't grow up with a culture, and I didn't really grow up even understanding what culture it was. I knew that my dad and my grandma, my aunties on that side, that we were different somehow. I didn't quite know what. But as I got older, and I noticed things like my health card looks different, and I had memories of my grandma's bannock and my dad's braid and things like this. I started to get an idea, but it was a secret to me. It wasn't told to me. And then when I was about 18, I sort of confronted my mom and I said, hey, I just came from a powwow and I've always felt really connected to this culture. And then that's when she told me, well, actually it's because you are that. But she didn't know specifically what tribe was, or she didn't tell me. So from that point forward, I knew that I was Indigenous, but I didn't know what kind of Indigenous, because there's many cultures within it. And it really wasn't until after theater school, I got hired at Native Earth in an administrative position in Toronto, and was so accepted into the Indigenous community and met all these people who accepted me and had heard my story, similar versions of my story before. And then I started learning that this is a common thing of mixed race people growing up outside the culture sort of forcibly. And then I moved back to Saskatchewan and then reunited with my family, and they live in Vancouver. And then once that happened, it's all of a sudden, a creator blessed me by bringing all these people into my life, these Indigenous mentors into my life. And I really owe a huge thank you to Yvette Nolan, who's been a great culture teacher to me and all of my Indigenous peers and friends. It's a constant process of education and reclamation. And so, yeah, I identify as Cree Soto / settler.
Thanks, Amanda. That was really beautifully said. Yeah, so I am from Winnipeg, Manitoba, born and raised, Treaty 1 territory. And I have two sides of my family. My mom's side is German, and my dad's side is Scottish Métis. And so when we think of Métis, I've learned, living in Ontario now, Métis kind of becomes synonymous for mixed or half. But where I come from, Red River Métis, which is capital M Métis, is a whole different thing. And that's when we talk about, that the Indigenous umbrella covers First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. That is the kind of Métis that I am. So my family has been in Treaty 1 since before its time, and before then I have ancestors of Dene and Cree ancestry from up in Great Slave Lake, who then came down and were part of the building of Fort Garry and the Hudson's Bay Company in Winnipeg and the fur trade and all of that. And similar to Amanda, my family, due to the cultural genocide that has happened within our community, hid it for many generations because we did have settler within us, and we were able to say, you know, well, we're just white. We just have dark hair. Maybe that's it. It was hidden for a long time. And my grandpa, growing up, remember seeing in his grandfather's house regalia and traditional medicines and things like that. And then when he grew older, he said, I don't think I'm getting the full picture, and talked to his parents. And my great grandparents said, nope, you're not missing anything. We're just white. That's all we are. And so he grew up and he talked to his siblings and kept saying, like, I don't think I'm getting the full picture. I have these memories. I remember these things and no one's telling me what it is. And, you know, he was born in the 30s. So at that point, you still would not be able to get a job. There was still quite a lot of discrimination. And it wasn't until he was grown and he had his own children that he said, I need to set this straight within my family while I'm still here. And so long before 23andMe and Ancestry.com, he did his own investigation and found out our ancestry and our heritage and completed that puzzle for himself. And by doing that, he made sure that all of his children were registered within the Manitoba Métis Federation, and all of his grandchildren were registered within the Manitoba Métis Federation. And then he passed. And it's been, for me, it's been the greatest gift that he could have given me and our family. Like Amanda said, it's a constant journey of education and reclamation and finding a voice and finding a space. But I am so honored that I get to live at a time right now where I can claim my ancestry and be proud of it, and be humbled by the fact that I didn't grow up with the traditions or the culture outside of, you know, we have a couple Métis flags at home, and my dad and my aunties have been involved with the Manitoba Métis Federation and volunteering, but it has been a journey, and it's also been really great to hear of other stories like Amanda and a lot of other of my Indigenous friends who didn't grow up with it. And that's the reality of the consequences of the cultural genocide that our community has faced. So it's been, you know, you kind of think, I definitely thought I was alone in this, that you go, oh God, I don't know anything. I didn't grow up with this. What is mine to claim? And then you look around and that's a lot of people's experiences. So yeah, I identify as capital M Métis and settler.
Thank you both for sharing that. It's already like, I knew this conversation was going to be important, but it's already like,
oh yeah,
I already feel like I've learned so much just from you guys talking, growing up in your background. So thank you so much for doing this. Much appreciated. And so many people are going to benefit from this conversation, white, non-white. Like, so thank you.
Thank you.
Next question. Have there been times in your career where you felt the need to hide your indigeneity? Or on the other hand, have there been times where you felt your indigeneity wasn't acknowledged enough?
I'll start this one if that's okay, Amanda.
Yes.
So I grew up and people always asked me what I was. You know, I have a round face, I have big features, I have dark features, I have, you know, a darker skin, more olive toned. And people would always say, what are you? You're something. What are you? There's some sort of spice going on there. What's happening? You know, whether it be walking into an agent or casting, or even when I'm waitressing, you know, people would always say, what are you? And I would say, I'm your waitress. Eat your freaking fries. But so for me, you know, it wasn't anything that I ever felt like I could hide, because assumptions are going to be made no matter what. And for me, it was most important that I was as upfront and honest as possible. I will say, though, that working in both musical theater and straight plays, that I found my indigeneity more utilized and more specifically used in straight plays than musical theater. I think that speaks a lot to the canon of musical theater itself, that, you know, I can play Ariel's sister and it doesn't matter where I come from. But that has been something that I've been grateful for, that, you know, the beginning of my career was a lot of musical theater, and it didn't come up a lot. So I was able to kind of just be Julie. And then when I started auditioning for things outside of Winnipeg or outside of my main community, it then became, I felt the Métis walk into the room before I did. You know, which is sometimes a tough thing to reconcile. I find that you go, okay, well, even, you know, it's the demons in my own head that are saying it, that go, well, am I checking a box, or why did I get this audition, or is it because of this, or da-da-da. But yeah, I don't think I've ever hit it. I think that when I've been able to be fully myself has been in shows that I've been able to celebrate my indigeneity. And like Amanda said, I think some of the most welcoming rooms where I didn't feel like I needed to explain myself, or I didn't feel like I needed to kind of be like, okay, well, here's what I am, and here's what it means, and here's the history, has been the rooms where I'm filled with Indigenous artists that are filled with Indigenous artists, and they just go, hey, what's up? So those spaces have been so beautiful to see and to be a part of, especially because in Winnipeg, there's no culturally specific theater. So we don't have a theater that we can go to see these stories being told. They might get put up once in a while at the main theaters. But my first experience with that was at Magnus Theatre in Thunder Bay, and we did a Drew Hayden Taylor play. And it was a 4-person cast, and it was all Indigenous artists. And I just remember walking in the first day and being like, oh, okay. Like, it just was a feeling that I hadn't felt before, which was really, really great to feel.
Yeah, I mean, look, I got a pale face, I got freckles, I got blue eyes. Nobody was ever sensing anything in me. So I grew up hearing racist things my whole life. So I thought, I have to hide this in order to survive. And I had some experiences in high school because, like, I've been registered since I was a baby. So, like, it's on my health card. So I think my high school knew, and they would attribute my teenage exhaustedness to, they thought I was on drugs, and they thought I was doing all these things, when in reality, I just knew I was a musical theater nerd, you know, and I was in my piano lessons and, you know, doing, I don't know, some dumb musical at night. So I was tired because that's what I was focusing my life on. But so I would get all these stern talks from teachers. So when I went to theater school, after I graduated high school, I dyed my hair blonde. And when I went to theater school, I went to Sheridan. I didn't tell any of the teachers, and I would sort of mention it to some peers or friends maybe, but I really tried to not make it a thing. And as I continued through Sheridan and saw, oh, well, the staff is mostly white, there's no Indigenous staff on here, and some teachers keep putting my friends who are artists of color in boxes and will not release them from these boxes, and, you know, forcing them to do this material that's dated and offensive. And I was like, shit, I don't want to sing songs from Pocahontas, so I need to keep doing this. And then in my 4th year, like, even though I hit it, you're never really surviving. You're never really happy. You always feel terrible and not accepted. So 4th year, I finally started doing some Indigenous material, some monologues from plays. And then, once I got to Native Earth, then I was like, okay, I'm owning this. it's who I am, and it hurts me to hide from it. And then since then, it's been strange. I find people only acknowledge my indigeneity when it's convenient to them, non-Indigenous people specifically. And one experience I had with a white director, I've auditioned for them, haven't worked with them, but I talked to them and like thanked them for making an effort to have diverse representation on stage. And then they like rolled their eyes, and I talked about how being Indigenous person especially, that's important to me. And then they rolled their eyes, and since then they've treated me consistently pretty rudely. And I think it's because one, they can't put me in a box that's easily understandable. And two, because they couldn't tokenize me, which is a privilege and a curse in its own right, because I don't have to think that, oh, I'm just in this role because I'm, you know, Indigenous. But then it also means that people think I don't deserve to be a part of the community. Non-Indigenous people think that specifically. So yeah, I find that because of the way I look, even when non-Indigenous people know that I am, they either think that I'm on their side about their racist opinions and views. So they go, oh, you understand, right? And I don't understand. Or they forget and say offensive things, or they treat me rudely all around because they just don't understand, and they don't think I have the right, or I get the right to be offended or to stand up for things, you know? It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think, Amanda, like if I can piggyback on that, I think that especially the theater industry and especially non-Indigenous theater makers have a really colonized view of what it means to be Indigenous.
Right.
And the assumption of knowledge and the assumption of traditions comes from a place that, like Amanda said, I can put you in a box and that's where you are and that's where you'll stay. But I think there's a lot of education that has to come through every facet of this world that we're working in, the theater world, to say that we cannot only put Indigenous artists up who fit the stereotype that we think, that have the long dark hair and, you know, the darker skin, because that's not the world we're living in. We're living in a world where there's a mix of cultures, and that does not negate someone's existence or identity within that community, and which means we have to have a full spectrum available to us in this representation, because I know for me, like, it wasn't, I didn't see any actors who were saying they were Métis growing up, right? And I was like, I can't be the only one.
Right.
And I wasn't, but it's I think people have a real, like, they like to be able to say you're this or you're this, and it's way easier to be able to put people in boxes. But that's not the reality of the world that we're living in right now.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So our next question. So white passing, or I read an article that said white seeming Indigenous person might be a better term. I can send you guys the article. It's actually really interesting. Anyway, so white passing or white seeming Indigenous people are thought to have a certain privilege in their respective community. Do you ever feel out of place telling Indigenous stories on stage because of this? And simply because we do a visual art?
Well, like in any community, you know, there are intersections of like shadeism and colorism. And so I have the privilege to walk down the street and not worry. Although I've still been followed by police, I think they have a sense of this stuff. They can just sense it's a little bit in you, because I have been followed by police around downtown. It's crazy. And because of my skin, I've been allowed to go into spaces that are harder for us to get into, like musical theater itself. Like Julie mentioned earlier, like musical theater doesn't have any Indigenous specific roles. There's there's now some musicals about Indigenous stories, but they're usually like all Indigenous. They're all about Indigenous stories. It's never just a character trait. So I've been allowed into these spaces. But I've never been made to feel out of place by my community because of this, because most Indigenous people I know, they've all got a cousin or something who's a little bit lighter. Like, it's just we've been targeted by whiteness to, to literally get the Indian out of us. So it's just part of our culture. So the only time I haven't been accepted has been by non-Indigenous folks. But the way my community kind of works is that everybody has a role and a place. So my role has been that of like a sort of spy. I get into all these spaces, I gather intel on what people's real opinions are of Indigenous people, so that when my brothers and sisters ask me about it, I can say, well, this person says this, and just know that before you work at XYZ. So yeah. And telling Indigenous stories, like, there obviously can be some roles that I shouldn't play, but it doesn't mean I'm still an Indigenous actor, and I still have an Indigenous life.
Yeah, well said, Amanda. I think, like Amanda said, there's a certain privilege that I have 100%, and it would be ignorant to not acknowledge that. Like Amanda said, generations before me have been able to just say, oh, I think it's the German, that we can claim to not be. And that was a survival tactic back then, and that was a privilege back then, and it still is a privilege for me now. But for me, that privilege means responsibility. And that means that I've got to do the work. And like Amanda said, if that means that I'm a mole and I'm in there and I'm changing things, or I'm, that people for ignorant reasons might be more willing to listen to me, then that means that I have to do 700% more work because of that. Because if I can make spaces safer for my friends and my community, then that's my job because of the way I look. So I take that really, really seriously. And especially right now, working in big institutions and historically white institutions, I know I am one of 6 Indigenous identifying actors who've ever been at the institution that I'm at right now. And so, that's a responsibility, because if it's not me, then who the heck is going to say these things? Who's going to push for what we need to feel safe in these rooms and in these audiences and in this town? So for me, I feel an immense responsibility to make sure that I'm checking in with my community, that I'm checking in with my friends, that I'm saying, is this in line? Do you agree with this? What else can I do? That I'm the back and forth. I think on stage, I also have the privilege of people looking at me, like I said, and saying, oh, you're something. Like that when I say Métis, they go, oh yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. So that is a privilege too. And I think it's something that I'm starting to realize that's similar to the Asian diaspora in musical theater, right? That quite often, I have friends who are Filipina who will play Vietnamese roles and vice versa. That if I'm taking a role on that is written for an Ojibwe woman, what are things that I need to do to make sure that I'm coming in as educated as possible? So, I've played an Ojibwe woman in the past, and I had to speak Ojibwe on stage. And so I made sure that I was going to the source and learning the language and doing everything I could to represent that fully. So yeah, like Amanda said, it's at the end of the day, I am an Indigenous actor, and I think that there's a lot of room. Like that part should have been played by an Ojibwe woman, 100%. So it's a tough thing, and I think probably I've come to a point now where I might not ever play roles that aren't specifically my heritage, and that's a journey that I've been on since starting to play more Indigenous specific roles.
Mm-hmm. But that's tough on its own, right?
Yeah.
Deciding what you only get so many roles that are Indigenous specific. So you may not be Ojibwe, but it's like, I want to take the opportunity to tell the story better than a non-Indigenous actor would, right? Like, how do you, that's a hard negotiation to have to make with yourself, you know?
Yeah, and I think for me, the best way forward is to be as open and say that I make sure in my bio that that no one's gonna say, oh, she's Ojibwe, that I'm like, I am Métis from Treaty 1, Winnipeg, Manitoba, this is not my culture, but I'm learning as much as I can, and I come humbly to know that I do not know enough in any sense of the word. So yeah, it's a tough, like you said, it's a tough balance to keep.
Yeah.
And Amanda, you were going to say something. I'm sorry I cut you.
I was just going to say, I'm so grateful that we're having this conversation. I'm so grateful to the movement that Black Lives Matter has created for talking and turning talking into action.
Absolutely.
Because like Julie, you mentioned how like now it's your responsibility to like do things about the injustices that you see. For me, for so long, because I just the way I deal with trauma and stuff, I would hold on to these things that I heard and I saw, and I would just like tell other people, but I wouldn't make any changes happen. I wouldn't engage in a dialogue. I was frankly too scared. But now, because of Black Lives Matter, I'm not scared anymore. You know, I'm sending emails to companies and people that I've worked with before saying, hey, these are some things you can do to change for the better. Hey, like this happened and I really want to talk with you about it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
that's amazing.
I'm very grateful.
That's great.
This is important. That kind of goes right into our next question, which is, so what actionable things would you want theaters to do to make safer spaces for Indigenous women in particular? I mean, Indigenous people, but specifically I'd like to talk about women as identified women. So yeah, start a little bit.
Yeah, that's one that I think I'm also trying to get educated on as myself. You know, for me, I think one of the basics that is important to me when I'm going to see a show, if it's a theater that I'm not necessarily well acquainted with, is a mindful and consistent and an action-based land acknowledgement. So something that doesn't feel like you're just reading it off the page and it's kind of a like, okay, well, we have to do this and then we're going to get to the good stuff.
Right.
Something that really takes that moment and that there's a reason behind it, and you can tell that that's part of the ethos of the culture of the theater itself. Mm-hmm. That's really important to me. I would like that to be consistent everywhere, and coming from Winnipeg, you know, a lot of the theaters there do have it, whether it's a recorded one or one in person or that's built into the show. The theaters in Winnipeg in the past few years have really gotten with it and had really good land acknowledgements. And again, coming into an institution here where it wasn't really the norm, and I felt like I was the only one looking around being like, what? Like, nothing? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, there's an education that has to happen about why those are important and why we need to have those daily reminders of what has happened to the Indigenous community and what is still happening to the Indigenous community, and that they don't need to be mournful, guilt-ridden moments before we see a show, right? That we are celebrating this land and we are acknowledging the pain of the past and the pain of the present and hoping to do better in the future. And I think that once we understand that it's not just lip service or reading the nations off a sticky note that you just, you know, you Googled how to pronounce them just before you went on stage, that's like that's the babiest of the baby steps. I've heard of theaters reading through the Truth and Reconciliation document that every week they would start their meetings with talking about some of the 95 actionable tasks that were given by the committee, that I'm like, that would be a great reminder of how can we integrate the hard work that was done, that we haven't seen a big step forward in terms of putting those 95 tasks into reality right now. So that's a big thing for me. I think just also learning about, you know, I'm a guest on this land that I'm at right now. And so for me, it's, I have to learn the history. And to have that as part of the ethos, especially we are transient people, right? For actors, we're going here, we're going there. That if on first day you say, here are the washrooms, here's the equity forms, oh, and just so you know, here's a quick rundown, here's a pamphlet about the history of the land that you're on. And that's a small thing that means I feel seen, I feel heard, I feel like my wants and needs are in line with the company. I've been thinking a lot about inclusion and what that means. And, you know, it's so like the policy is one thing, but the feeling of inclusion and belonging and being seen and being heard and like you have a voice that they want to hear, that's a feeling. That's not, you know, that's not a policy. It's something that has to be entrenched within the theater and the institution.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, like cultural training for out-of-town artists is, and creatives is such an important part of it. And I'm going to get a little boring with some numbers here to emphasize that point. These numbers are from the 2016 census. So Canada overall, 4.9% of our population is Indigenous. In Ontario, which is where a lot of people are based and from, the population of Indigenous people there is 2.8%. Here in Saskatchewan, the population of Indigenous people is 16.3%. So I've had experiences because I'm from Regina. I live in Saskatoon now, which is on Treaty 6, but I'm from southern Saskatchewan, Regina area. So I've had like friends I went to theater school with come and work at the Globe and then say some really, really offensive things to me just because they've never met an Indigenous person before or like been around and seen Indigenous people on walking around before. And so culture training is an easy thing that I think theaters can do for us. And also mention some things, and before I say this, I'll say Indigenous opinions are not a monolith. Everybody will have different feelings. But some things that really hurt me in theater are strict gender binaries. And in musical theater, you know, that's very enforced. We've got vocal types and all these things. And we're starting to play with gender in musical theater, but there's so much farther we can go. And gender is like gender binaries is a very colonial thing, especially with the beauty expectations of being a woman, right? Like that thin privilege is real. And I have thin privilege, but often I find myself being the body diversity in a cast, which is crazy because I have thin privilege. But I do, like my body was inherited from my dad. I'm meant to survive -40 winters. Like there's no way I'll ever look like the rest of the women in a typical musical theater ensemble. Hierarchies in theater, you know, storytelling is very sacred, and to me it just always has been sacred. It's just without effort. It's part of who I am. And so part of why I'm Saskatchewan based now is that here I tend to do more ensemble based theater. You know, the concept of lead versus ensemble is sort of arbitrary to me because it's sacred no matter what part you play in it. And that creates a class divide, which again is a colonial thing. And outreach is another thing that people can do, theaters especially. And this will help everyone, like having tickets available to low income families. And I mean like proper, not like $50 isn't a cheap ticket. Like I want like pay what you can tickets for low income people.
Absolutely.
And so that they don't feel guilty. They have a right to see theater. Growing up and knowing how to act in a theater is a privilege, you know? So that will make people feel welcome in the space. And same with a lot of theaters have theater classes that they offer to kids. Have kids come in who can't pay for the classes. Have a scholarship, find a way, make it work. Because that's the way that we're going to continue building representation in theater, is by making sure that these kids who don't have the means are allowed into our spaces. Yeah, musical theater composers. I think we're in a Canadian musical theater genesis. Great shows are being written, but like Come From Away is thought of as the most Canadian musical ever, but there's no Indigenous people in it. So it's like, oh, well, I guess we're invisible. So write roles for us, and write roles not centered around trauma. Write roles
Yes.
just a fact of who we are.
Yes.
Yes, Amanda, exactly. That we cannot there's a desensitivity that happens when we see Indigenous roles, specifically women, dying, crying in traumatic roles on stage. That trauma porn, that idea that any Indigenous show you're going to see is going to be about the atrocities that have happened. Those stories need to be told, but we need to see also Indigenous love stories and friendship and mother-daughter relationships and joy and comedy that isn't based in this, because that's why when a theater puts up an Indigenous show, none of the white audiences come, because they don't want to sit there and they don't want to feel their guilt and they don't want to go, oh, but, because then they have to do something about that.
Right.
So let's have both sides of the coin. We need to see those stories, but that can't be the only way that we're interacting with Indigenous actors on stage.
My
That's
God.
talk.
Oh my God. Yes. Oh my God. I'm just like, you're like, yes. Oh my God. Okay, sorry. I need to compose myself, Jesus.
But this is what I'm saying. Like, this conversation has needed to happen, and I'm sure
Oh my God.
you guys may have had these conversations with your friends and your groups and your Indigenous friends and artists, but like, I never hear this stuff. I never, you know what I mean? It's like, I want to be a part of the club so I can learn.
Yes.
Like, I'm not, it's
Like,
just,
tap me in.
I'm standing with you. I'm an ally. I got you.
Absolutely.
It's like, this is.
I'm so happy.
Yay. Oh, I'm so happy. This is awesome.
Oh my God. I could cry. Feel emotional.
100%. And that's why this beautiful racial awakening that's happening, that's being led by the Black Lives Matter movement, behooves every freaking body. Doesn't matter where you come from, what you are, what your heritage is, what you look like. This is lifting us all up to the next level. So
Absolutely.
That's why these conversations are there's so much shared analysis and shared knowledge that that is going to help us get to this next level of humanity.
Absolutely.
That we so need.
Absolutely.
Especially in our industry, like theater it's so funny because artists, we're like the most empathetic people, and we are the people who can influence and change and really make this stuff stick and happen. And I find so many issues within our own community that I'm like, no, people need to take a hard look at themselves. Companies need to take a hard look at themselves and really like, what are you actually doing for your marginalized people? What are you actually doing for us?
Nothing, period.
Well, pretty much. You got to do anyway, this is the last question, and I'm not going to say the most important, but does representation matter?
Absolutely. Period. I mean, you have to see yourself represented on stage in order to believe that you have a place there, right? And like, a kid growing up won't want to be in a profession where they don't see themselves reflected.
Absolutely.
We have a duty to all kids always get me, so I keep talking about kids, but we have a duty to children, honestly, to make them feel like they belong in this society and this business.
100%. Representation is the thing that ignites every dream for kids, right? And not only that, like Amanda, my body was made to survive -50. So I am not a bone thin woman, but even seeing representation right now of my own body on stage, I'm like, and it's not even about seeing myself on stage, but me seeing everyone on stage means that it changes my worldview of not just people who look like me and who sound like me and who have my ancestry, but if I'm seeing everybody on stage and the representation across the board of ability, of gender, of race, of size, of gender, I said that already, but but if I'm seeing all of that, then my idea of the world is widened into its fullest form, which I think is so important, that I don't need to just see me as the hero of the story. I need to see everybody else as the hero of the story too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Sorry.
Okay over there?
Sorry. Continue.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything else you would like people to know? And again, we say this as you're not speakers for the entire, for your Indigenous tribe or your nation. Like, as Julie and as Amanda, as Indigenous artists, is there anything else you would like people to know or us to know, or anything you want to say? Like, space is yours.
Well, Terry, you mentioned just before this that like you've always wanted to be a part of these conversations and stuff. And I think, all of us as racialized folks in theater, we have our survival instincts on. So I think part of the reason that these conversations haven't happened with people outside of our respective communities is that we've all just been trying to survive in this business that is against all of us and is trying to ostracize all of us. So, be compassionate with yourself, all of us. Like, I know me just trying to survive sometimes, it's made me not see things that have happened and made me kind of a bad ally sometimes. But now I'm going to forgive myself and I'm going to keep going and be better every day. And I think every racialized person deserves to both forgive themselves and love themselves and continue forward in humility and love.
That's exactly it, Amanda. Yeah, like we both said at the beginning, this is a journey of education and reclamation, and I feel like that's my purpose on this earth, even if I wasn't an artist, that's my duty to my ancestors and to my heritage and to my grandpa. And so I think that education doesn't stop within, the Métis Nation. It needs to go to every person that I come in contact with. I need to be able to say, I see you and I hear you and I'm with you and what can I do to help? Because like we're learning right now, that's when, shit gets real, is when we can all come together and say, oh, you're experiencing that, I experienced that in a different way, or I see what you're going through here, I kind of went through a similar thing. Let's get together and let's be able to confront this in bigger numbers that aren't just, the specific group that we belong to.
And I'll also add that just some shout outs of things. So collectiveaction.ca is a website created by some members of the Prime Minister's Youth Council, Alfred Burgesson especially. So there you can go, they have a little form and it's like they have 5 demands to adjust racial issues. Like one of them is defund police and build these things, and it will send it to, you'll put in your postal code and it'll send this email with your name and you can personalize it to every politician that you were connected with at the federal, municipal, provincial level. So collectiveaction.ca and Indigenous specific, this is a great book. It's called Medicine Shows, Indigenous Performance Culture by Yvette Nolan. And it gives a history of Indigenous theater and where we are now. And Yvette's a really great writer. So it's just a really great read and it'll help you understand the culture in general.
I have another two too. One book is the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. By Bob Joseph. It's really great. It's a really quick read, and it's just talking about the Indian Act that is still intact today and the cultural genocide that's happened within that and how it's been upheld. It's a really, really great read. It's really interesting. And again, it's pretty easy to digest, that one. And then also there's a podcast called Voicing the Circle that is produced and hosted by Dylan Chiblow. And he's talking to Indigenous artists and non-Indigenous artists and white artists. And it's just a conversation, and he's bringing his culture and his heritage into these conversations, and it's really nice to listen to. And I may be one of the guests, but
It's so funny.
Well, we just want to say thank you again for coming on here, for sharing your experiences, for being so open and discuss and talk about such an important thing. We can't continue, honestly.
Yes.
It's like that feeling that you get, you're talking about the feeling of inclusion. Like it feels good when you have these conversations and it seems like you're learning and and acknowledging, you know, like in this conversation, I'm acknowledging things that I've done and things that I've said, and like, so just thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, it's been an awakening. I'm like, I feel great. You gave me all the energy today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
This space is your space. We made this for us. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for coming on. And until next time.
See you later.
Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and visit our website, musicaltokens.com, for your daily dose of